The Deep End The Deep End team acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands on which we work and live, pays respect to elders past, present and future, and recognises the importance of Indigenous knowledge to informing public debate. Glenn Loughrey is a Wiradjuri man and a reverend in the Anglican Church of Australia. He has served as the Vicar of St Oswald's, Glen Iris in Melbourne since 2016. He is also an artist and author who holds a special interest in Indigenous issues and was also appointed a canon and artist in residence of St Paul's Cathedral in Melbourne in 2021. In that role, he designed a series of 3 glass panels for the cathedral's entrance that depict the traditional lands on which it stands. He opened the Murnong Gallery for Aboriginal Art as a social enterprise of St Oswald's in 2022. He presently serves as the Diocese of Melbourne's designated advocate for the voice and constitutional recognition for First Nations people in Australia. He is affiliated as an associate professor with the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University.
So Aaron and I are absolutely thrilled to have you on the Deep End podcast.
Welcome to the Deep End.
Thank you.
And you're a very significant figure in our lives. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, to say a little bit about yourself. You live here in Narm. We're here on the South Bank campus of the University of Melbourne. We're actually in the Ian Potter Centre of the Melbourne Conservatorium, and we're on the country of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples. So, as I say, you're a very significant person in our lives, Glenn, for all sorts of reasons. So I'd like to ask you, first of all, to tell us a little bit about yourself. I think it'll come as quite a surprise to our listeners to learn about your life and what you do.
Thank you, Marcia. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be on the land of the Wurundjeri people where I am today. I'm a Wiradjuri person from central New South Wales. I grew up in a family that was a non-identifying First Nations family for a whole lot of reasons, because if people understand the history of our country, Mudgee and Bathurst was part of the major war in 1924, which was about extermination. And much of the people around the area where I grew up suffered that process. I'm now here on Narm, and I'm an Anglican priest. I'm a canon at the cathedral. I do some work with the university, Australian National University, in the Crawford School of Public Policy and Water Justice, and on a number of different boards. I'm also an artist, and if people are interested, they can go to the cathedral and walk in the front door and they'll see some major pieces of glasswork which I designed. I didn't actually make them. They were done by that wonderful team down at Wutherong Glass. So I have an interest in this process on the basis that growing up, I was not allowed to be myself. I struggled with the way our family had been treated over the years and the way we were treated. And I grew up conscious of my difference, but not sure of how to do or what to do, and no real guidance on what to do about that. So I've ended up here.
How did you become an Anglican priest?
I suspect it was the whitest thing a blackfella could do, Marcia. It was a way of, when I first started to feel my spirituality in the bush, because we had no connection with culture, the only place I could put it was into the church. And the church was one of the few places, I think, where my father thought that he was equal to everybody else on a Sunday morning for an hour or two. And he remained sort of in a conflicted position with the church over all of his life, but he gave a lot of time supporting it. And I think it was one of the few places where he felt that he was treated as equal by others. And over the years, I guess that's the journey for me. When I left school, I became a Salvation Army officer, which was on the other end of the kind of spiritual spectrum. Then I spent a time in corporate business, had a long-term trouble with the bottle as a result of that, and then came back into the church in the 2000s, still working through who I was as a person. Today, it's an interesting place to be because I have moved further into my what I call Aboriginality, and I am juggling. I'm doing the tightrope walk a bit. I stand on top of the fence. Don't stand with one leg on either side. I'm on top of the fence trying to find a new way to hold those things together if they deserve to be held together at all.
You mentioned the Mudgee War.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit more about that, please.
Okay. Mudgee War was a part of the Bathurst War, which occurred in 1824, was finally declared as martial law in August 1824 by Governor Brisbane, and it was known as the War of Extermination. There'd been a long-running issue over 23, 24 between the local Wiradjuri people who were well organised, and they were a well-organised military group who knew what they were about and were joined by a lot of other tribes from around that central west and southern central area in conflict with the settlers and with the military. William Cox is allegedly to have said that after an incident where one of his workers was killed, that the only way to deal with this vermin is to exterminate them, men and women and children. And growing up, and Mudgee was on the northern end of those Bathurst wars, but it was all included in the one place. And in Mudgee, it's said that almost 100% of the Aboriginal people were wiped out before 1876. When I grew up in Mudgee in the 1960s, early 60s, when I was 5 or 6, my father and mother would not allow us to drink anything that didn't come out of our car if we went out because they were still scared of poisoned water. My friends at school, and I have a good friend from school who talks about stories about his great-grandfather and others being involved in hunting parties, going out hunting, not for rabbits or kangaroo, and doing things such as stirruping, etc. It was a fairly brutal place. It's a history that really hasn't been unpacked.
Those cuts run very deep, don't they? I mean, this is not ancient history for you.
No. No, it's part of my whole being. It's really had an impact on how I think about myself. It made it very clear when I look back about my father how we suffered the violence in the home because he was never game to speak up outside of the home and upset the white fella, because to do so was a dangerous thing to do. When there were incidences that affected me personally as a small child, which should have been reported to police and to hospitals, as a result of some abuse, I lost the capacity to walk. My left hip was dislocated. Nobody went to the police and nobody went to the hospital, because to do so would have meant that both of us, my brother and I, would have probably been taken away. And it wouldn't have been because of my family's misbehaviour, it was because of other people's misbehaviour. But we would have been blamed. So those things are very difficult things to deal with, and you live with them. I don't have any desire to go back and revisit or to get revenge or to mete out justice or whatever on those sort of situations. They've been things that have driven me in this process to want to see the statement from the heart in all its fullness put into place, so that our kids going forward don't have to live through this stuff. Our families, our parents, their mothers and fathers don't have to live through this, that we change the way our world is and we shift that dynamic.
So this year you have been the Diocese of Melbourne's designated advocate for the voice and constitutional recognition for First Nations people in Australia. That must have taken you on taken you on a pretty eye-opening journey, I imagine.
Uh, it's I've looked at the underbelly of Australia, and once seen, you can't unsee it. I think what I've learned in this process, and I've done around 110 presentations since March, which is probably not as many as Marcia or Thomas and others have done, but it's been a lot for me inside a very specific market, which is the faith communities primarily, all faith communities, not just Christian. And it's been a space where I've been absolutely surprised at the negativity that sits in it, the fear that sits within it, the inability to let go of a worldview that sees Western thought and faith and practice as a predominant one, and has no ability to understand that there is another way to live and be in this world, that people have not a great deal of understanding of how colonialism and modernity were the frameworks around which the Western world was created, and around which things like language, race, and religion became the universals that depicted or denoted who was a real person. Our people don't understand that when I say that this is a racist system, it's not about the individual, it's about the system that was built and funded, empowered by that right back in the beginning, and it continues to do so now. So it's been a real eye-opener for me. Somehow giving our people a voice in the Constitution challenges God's sovereignty, which is often raised.
Wow.
That, there's only one sovereign, that's God. And I go, yes, that I understand where you come from with that philosophy. But in this particular place, we're talking about the sovereignty, if you want to continue that idea, that God delegated to our people. And if that's how you want to see the world. But it's, so there is that comes out all the time. The other one that comes out all the time is that, for Christians, everybody is equal. And I go, yeah, well, that may be all right for Christians inside their churches, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about justice for those who are outside of your particular space. And we have a responsibility to ensure that there is justice for those people. That is part of who we are and what we have to do. If there is no justice for one, there is no justice for anyone. So we try, but it's been you're right. I've been amazed, and I would suspect that in the church, it's a line ball between yeses and nos.
And yet it is still a line ball, which actually gives us some cause for optimism.
Yeah, but I've always been told I'm an optimist.
I prefer to be optimistic. The appeals to theological interpretation, are these hiding potentially a deeper fear about, what will just happen in terms of material loss if this gets voted up, do you think?
Oh, yeah, look, I once I mentioned things like Makarrata, people's hand goes to their wallets and their house keys.
Right.
Okay?
Oh, when you're reading the room, yeah?
Yeah.
When you're reading the body language.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow.
That people, that's and that people are concerned that somehow they're going to lose something. And I remind them that fear is well-founded, because if you steal something from somebody, you're always scared that somebody's going to pinch it back off you.
Yeah.
And that's part of the colonial memory that I talk to people about, that we have to unpack. We have to unpack, how did I become such a privileged person in this environment when the people who were here before have lost everything that means something to them? So how do I come to grips with that? And how do I then take steps to adjust myself to that. There's a great story in the Bible, which is Jacob, who pinches everything from Esau, takes his birthright, takes everything, pinches his land, and disappears, gets married, has a couple of wives and a bunch of kids, and gets a lot of animals and becomes famous. And when he's coming back home, he wants to go and see the oldies, and he's coming back home and he gets to Peniel, and he sends, and I often say to people, he does the bravest thing I know any man could do. He sends his 2 wives and kids on ahead to meet Esau to see how Esau's going to behave. And that's got to be pretty brave, hasn't it? When you catch up to the wives later, he might have got a bit of a tongue lashing. Anyway, he stays overnight and he wrestles, and the Bible tells us that he wrestles with a young man. And often that's interpreted as an angel or as God. But I interpret it as the young man Jacob was when he ripped off Esau. And he is working through that night his conscience,
the inner struggle,
his colonial memory. He is doing the hard work of learning to live with himself. And the conversation about a blessing is exactly that, learning to live with himself so he can change his future behavior. He wakes up in the next morning with a new name called Israel, got a new purpose, but he also wakes up with a dislocated hip. He learns to walk with a limp for the rest of his life, which reminds him of that moment and that whole story. If we take that as a context about this whole process of transformational forgiveness that begins with voice, goes through treaty, truth, and Makarata, we end up with the idea that Australia, after this is over, will walk with a limp. It'll be different, not as punishment, but as pedagogy, as learning, as growing, as becoming. And it's really important. I also remind people at that stage that Makarata has to do with something called a spear in the thigh. And I go, and do you know who did a spear in the thigh on behalf of all of the world? The last act on the cross was Jesus had a spear in the side. And the first thing he shows everybody when he comes back is, have a look at this. This is what I did for you. Now you have to go and walk differently. So this is a very powerful motif for that whole Christian, anyway, motif. It's incredible, and I don't understand why people don't get it and see it as a transformational process, a forgiveness. Absurd forgiveness, I call it, absurd. Because how can people like us, who have been totally decimated by others, turn around and offer a hand of forgiveness and going for a walk? It's absurd.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking, as you say that, these motifs are quite common. They run throughout all belief systems all over the world. They really do.
Yep.
They're not contained to Christianity or the Australian continent or any other place we could think of.
Now, the interesting thing is, though, I often say to people, Aaron, is we were here for 65,000 years. God never at any point in that period decided that he had to send Jesus to die for any of us.
That's a good point.
And because we had a model, which is that voice, treaty, truth, Makarata model, which we used inside of our communities to repair our communities when things went wrong. And God took that model and put it into the world. And he also added a little bit of the spear and said, that's a great idea. I might use that. I do cause some problems for some theologians, but, I think we have to think and understand in a much wider focus.
Well, what would be the point if we weren't causing problems for people? We've talked about the people you've met who are struggling with the proposition, but let's invert the question. What about the people who are actually doing well with it and recognizing and accepting the need for the voice? How are they reconciling that in themselves? Are they?
Look, I think there's a lot of people who have looked at it and said, look, really, this is just common sense. We need to repair the damage done at the beginning of this country, and we need to find a way to move forward. And this seems to me to be a very sensible approach. I did a session at a church, and this 17-year-old boy who was from an Indian family came up to me and said, we're going to a referendum. And I said, yes. He said, I guess you have to be 18. How can I vote? And I sort of said, well, unless we do something to your birth certificate, you probably can't. But he then talked about the process of how does he talk to his mates at school so they can go home and talk to their parents about the process. And he was a whole family, and his parents were of the same ilk that said, we came to Australia, you have now got a privileged life which you would never have had in India. You need to pass that on. So I think there are people understanding that process. When I unpack it in the way I do, in that circular motion, I often get people coming up afterwards and say, well, almost always, I was a no when I came here. Now I understand all I have to do is open the door, and I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to do that and see what happens. And see that this is not that Western rational mindset. This is the Aboriginal process, how to learn to be in place and how to learn to follow our normal processes. So I find a lot of people, there's a lot of parishes who have actively got involved and put signs up, have run groups, done a lot of work. And there's, a lot of communities. And I've worked with the Sikh community, I've worked with the Jewish community, and they've all been open to this discussion and of taking positive action. I do think, quite frankly, that the revolution has already begun. I think if I could get the year 5 and 6 students to vote across Australia, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
I agree.
And I see that inside schools all the time. So whatever happens on the 14th, it's the last gasp of those people who want to take us back 50 years, because ultimately this process will occur. If it doesn't occur on the 14th, it will occur because of our kids.
I do agree with you on that front. I think that whatever foundation we lay this year for the generation of kids in school now and the generation of kids in school after them, no matter what happens, it won't be over, will it?
No, it's not over. And it won't be over. It'll be very, very disappointing. And those people who have been our allies will be deeply shamed by their fellow Australians. Our people will once again go, just another day in the colonies. We put hope in this lot and they've let us down again. And it'll have negative impacts on our people. But it will also affect our kids, because they will turn around and go to their parents and go, what were you thinking? This was a no-brainer.
So I'd like to focus on both, what happens with a no win and a yes win. But let's just say hypothetically it's a no win to start with, and then maybe Marcia can ask you about the yes win afterwards. You've spent your entire career bringing people together in ways that have actually individually greatly inconvenienced you. And, you've shown great humility and respect and generosity in the way that you've tried to bring people together from really different walks of life, and that's very difficult to do. So I consider you to be a very wise expert in these processes. What is the best way, if it is a no-win, for those of us who do believe in the Yes campaign to keep going forward constructively?
I think one of the things we have to do is to take a short time out and sit and feel what it feels like to be in this place where we have had another no. Understand the depth of that emotion and feeling, and then make the decision, is that where we want to be for the rest of our life? Or do we want to continue to make the changes that are necessary? We have to keep speaking, and we have to keep speaking into those places of power, but also into those places where there have been people who have been our allies in this process. And we have to empower them to remain in the conversation with us as we move forward. It will depend on what the no looks like. If we win in the big bucket, but not in the small buckets, then as far as I'm concerned, we've got a yes and we just go for it.
Right.
And we just go for it and we just get ourselves together and we work with people like Marcia and those people who were going to be around the centre of this thing if it was a yes, and we push forward and we keep on making our voices heard and we don't back off. I'm negotiating at the moment with the Diocese of Melbourne towards having, and the province of Victoria, for having an Aboriginal body with a senior Aboriginal cleric so that we can begin this process within our own province, so that if it's a yes, what's it look like and what do we do and how do we make it work and how do we help people make that transition? If it's a no, how do we make it work? How do we help people cope and how do we make the transition? Same thing, but we have to do it from two different places. And I think it's important. I think there are some amazing things happening in Perth, in Bunbury, the Bunbury Diocese of the Anglican Church. The bishop there started a process a number of years ago of working with the local elders to write an apology on behalf of the church and on behalf of Anglicans who were not in the institution but came to church and their behaviour. And they wrote that process, and on the 30th of August they presented an apology, but not a blanket apology. It was an apology to a clan.
Mm.
And now they're going to every other clan and doing the same thing.
Wow.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of conversations we have to kick off, whether it's a yes or a no.
Mm.
And we can't give up our dream and our vision.
No.
A dream that we bring this nation together around the first peoples of the nation. We bring this nation together around us in a way that overcomes the innately race-based way we see ourselves, and we become one for the first time. And I think we just can't give up the dream. We have to keep on going, and we, regardless of whether it's a yes or no, what we're doing here, we've just started the Murnong First Peoples Gathering Place with the approval of the elders and others for the inner east of Melbourne, where there are no places for Aboriginal people to gather. And over the time from just before the referendum and until week or two or three or whatever afterwards, we're opening up our garden and fire pit and all the rest of it to get in and to talk with Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people about where we go to now, keep that conversation going.
You raise a very good point. For those of us who've been working for equity and justice all our lives, the old habit of wanting a better world is not going to go away. And if Australians vote no in the majority, or if a majority of states don't deliver a majority of votes, our way of life, yours and mine, and Aaron's, won't change. We'll still be here doing what we always do. And those people who ran the no campaign, who lied about all sorts of things, claiming that colonisation was good for us, that the Indigenous budget is $30 billion a year, which is an egregious lie, that, all we have to do is get a job and we'll close the gap. That doesn't work for the vulnerable, the sick, the extremely disadvantaged who live in remote areas where there are no high schools, no kindergartens, no clinics. They will continue to do what they do too, right? And they'll continue to make the situation worse as they do. So the job doesn't go away. I hope, though, that younger Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will understand the existential threat facing us and get on board with doing a better job of closing the gap. become more involved in their community work, their communities, and work towards better outcomes. I think, those non-Indigenous Australians who are going to vote no will later on down the track think, well, why isn't the gap closing? And we'll still have the job of explaining to them why the gap isn't going to close, because it's certainly not going to close on the basis of the propositions put by the No campaign, because they're a nonsense. So the work remains, the job doesn't change. We'll do what we do, they'll do what they do, and the world will be the same. And the situation for at least a third of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population will become much, much worse over time, because the majority of our population is young, and they're the ones who simply don't have access to the opportunities that other Australians have. So, I mean, you're not going to stop doing what you're doing, are you, Glenn?
No, I am not, and I know you don't, and I will continue on doing it. The thing for me is, I think for some of our people who are on the side of the no, they will realise if it is a no, in some time afterwards, just the impact of what they've done, because they'll begin to see the impact in the communities that they belong to, affecting their own families, etc. I suspect our young people, as you rightly said, if they have no voice in any kind of form, or no possibility of developing their self-determination, will protest with the only thing they have on, and that's their body. And that protest will be against others, or against themselves, or against those within their family. And our situation will just grow much, much worse in the short to medium term. And we're going to have a bigger set of issues to deal with. The problem with closing the gap is that the closing the gap is always the work we have to do. White fellas never close the gap down. They always ask us to climb the ladder up to them, and they never change the way the world looks. So we have some real work in trying to change some mindsets in that place as well. But you're right, Marcia. None of this is going to go away. We're not going to go away. Some people say to me, you need to fight. And I go, no, I don't need to fight. I need to remain. I need to remain and be a thorn in the side of those who are sitting in power, and keep on talking on behalf of those people who don't have the capacity, because of our system, to speak on their own behalf.
So let's go to those who don't have the power or capacity to speak on their own behalf. You and I speak to these people every day. They don't want to speak to the media. They don't want to be in public life. In many ways, their lives are so much harder than for non-Indigenous Australians. Tell me from your experience, and talking to your parishioners, what are the challenges they face, and is there any possibility that one day they will have a voice?
Oh, wow, yeah, that's a big question. Look, if we don't get this process over the line, my answer is that it's going to be many years before they even have the opportunity to get a voice. I do work in places outside of Melbourne, and I've watched over the years in those communities where people who have been abandoned by the government, who have been consulted on everything possible but listened to on none of them, whose young people watch as their adults lose the motivation due to the lack of, there's no work in this town, there's no water in town, there's no good water in town. We have to find ways to help them to find their identity, and to find ways to speak into power that doesn't necessarily involve them in this direct, full-on contact that you and I are in on many occasions. And as you know, I've seen so many wonderful people who get up in front of a room full of white people and really don't know how to handle and speak in that space, because it's just threatening to them. and we have to make spaces available. We have to engage with those people and give them avenues to have a voice. I use art in that way, but there are a whole lot of other things that we need to look at going forward. I think there are some very powerful young people out there if we give them the opportunity to, and can open up their vision of what's available for them to use. I also think the other thing is we have to get away from the idea that Aboriginal people are culture. We are people, and we need to be treated, and we don't talk about white culture, maybe because there isn't much, but we don't talk about people in that context. You know, I've had to laugh in this whole conversation. It's because people go, does all Aboriginal people agree with the voice? Why don't all Aboriginal people agree with the voice? And I go, for goodness sake, not everybody in Melbourne agrees that Richmond is the best football team. Why do you expect us all to agree on the voice? That is a kind of blanket expectation that we never have on any other conversation we ever have with non-Indigenous people. But we expect every Aboriginal to agree. And it's kind of this reducing us down.
When has anybody in a large group of people ever agreed on anything?
Yeah. Well, I usually say to them, when your grandmother died and you got the extended family together, did you all agree on what you were going to do with the house? And usually the answer is no. And I go, yeah, well, why would you agree? I said, and we have some pretty good reasons not to agree on this. I just wish those that didn't agree would stay with the fact.
I was interested in what you said before about the big bucket and the small bucket. So the single majority versus the double majority. I hadn't thought of that, actually. Now, clearly under Australian constitutional law, a double majority is necessary to carry a referendum. But a single majority without the double majority, it is a technical defeat, but it's not really scorched earth, is it? I mean, it does prove that more than half of the people living on this continent with the right to vote are agreeable. You know, it's a rounding error in where they live, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. Look, I think if I walk down the street knowing that we won the majority in the big bucket, I will feel very differently to walking down the street if we didn't win the big majority in the big bucket. If we win the majority in the big bucket, I know that there is the majority of people around me have a positive understanding of me. But if I walk down the street and we've lost at 40-60, that's going to be really difficult to do. To walk into any group of people knowing 2/3 of the people around you are against you, I think that's going to have a massive impact on our people. But if we can get it over the line in the big bucket, for me, that gives us a starting place. It gives us a sense of that we are real and that we have been heard by the majority of people, even though Alfred Deacon's little system didn't work for us at this time. And I think we've got to take as many positives out of this as we can get. I don't think we can just go, oh, well, we lost it. Well, that's it, you know. No, look at the way it works. One of the things about this whole process, even though some of the conversation has been pretty awful, 10 or 15 years ago, we wouldn't have had this conversation. The conversation wouldn't have been in the newspapers. It wouldn't have been on the TV. It wouldn't have been talked about. There wouldn't have been large groups of people gathering to discuss this. I think we've come quite some way to get into the psyche of Australians. And I think one of the reasons why I say we still have to, when this is all over, we pull up our big person pants, turn around and go out and say, we're still here and we still have to deal with this and you still have to deal with this. I don't think we can go away from that.
I don't know where they think we're going to go if they vote no. You know, I'm alarmed to think that if the no vote wins, that people think that, you know, like they did 100 years ago, that will just assimilate. I mean, you're living proof that, you know, one does not just assimilate.
No.
Aboriginal culture has a strong hold on people, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah.
And, you know, I think we're going to have a fight ahead of us if the no vote wins in hanging on to our culture. The odds will be even greater. So we're going to have to be pretty smart especially in what we say to young people
Yep.
about how to proceed from here. What would be your advice to the young in those circumstances?
My advice to the young is it goes back again to this process that once this is over, take some time, and if you can go on country, that's fine, or just listen to the country that's within you so that you begin to rejuvenate the capacity to remain in this space. Understand the history about the questions that we're talking about the work that has been done to get to where we are, and about the issues facing our people, both in remote and in urban areas. Educate yourself, remain proud of who you are. I say to people, no one ever can take away my sovereignty as an Aboriginal person, because it's in there. I carry country in my body. And one of the things I say to young people is, you carry country in your body. You're never off country. Country is always with you. So listen to your body and listen to who you are. Listen to your big gut, your big brain. Listen to the way you feel, and start to be proud that you're a part of a warrior tradition, and that you have the opportunity to pave and strive and work to improve the conditions for our people. It's great if you go and be a lawyer, but while you're being a lawyer, remember who you are as an Aboriginal person, and come back to that. Judge what you do in that place by who you are as an Aboriginal person and what your insides say to you about those things. And I would say to them, find some good elders, listen to some good people, sit at the feet of people who have things to say to you, even though they sometimes are uncomfortable things to say. It's uncomfortable things to say. And, you know, I guess I've grown up through, you know, Perkins and Mansell and Co. and listening to Marcia and Uncle Pat. And these people have been significant in shifting my head about who I am. Yes, you have, Marcia. You've played a major role in how I think about this. And we need to help our young people to find similar people to work with and to listen to and to hang on to and to be critical. Understand that when people say they're Aboriginal and are speaking on our behalf, are they actually doing so? Be critical. Critique the way people speak and live and act. There's a lot in there, and I hope one day we'll be able to get young people together and do some of this work with them. I use that statement from the Heart Circle, Voice, Treaty, Truth, Makarrata, to help unpack some of these kind of ideas. You know, what do we think? What do we agree on? How do we feel? And how are we going to walk differently after we've had this conversation? And if we can get young people into those kind of processes, I think, you know, we have something to offer them.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
So, heading into the final question, and I want to thank you deeply for all of your generosity and time and wisdom and compassion today. For people heading into the referendum on the 14th of October who are genuinely undecided, what would you say to them?
You still have time to educate yourself. So if you don't know, find out, do some work. There are lots of us around that will help you to do that. But the other thing that I would say to them is this. Listen to what's within you as to what the right thing is to do. Is Australia mature enough today to simply allow Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to be included in the Constitution from which we were excluded because we were told we weren't going to be here by the year 2000? Is it appropriate that we, as the First Peoples, are treated as equals and have the opportunity to provide advice on matters that relate to us? Just remember, it's a simple process. We can't veto anything. We can't legislate anything. We can't do anything other than give you some advice when you need it. It's that absurd generosity. We give you a gift, and when you unwrap it, it's got a gift voucher on it. And the gift voucher says you can say yes. And when you turn the gift voucher around, it says, now you've said yes, we're going to allow you, give you the gift to shape your yes to be useful for purpose through your democratic process. We're not even going to tell you how to do it. That's absurd generosity. So you're not being compelled. We're not telling you what to do. We're just giving you the opportunity to do what is right and just.
When you put it like that, I struggle to comprehend how it's 2023 and this is even a question. So thank you very much for your time, Glenn. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.